Good afternoon. On behalf of the School of Undergraduate Studies, I welcome all of you to this special event that has been planned around a new book, which some of you might already have seen and even read or dipped into. Dipped into is actually Professor Nair's phrase. And I think it's an excellent approach to this more than 400-page book. With its more than 200 keywords, it's a book that you can savor intermittently, skip pages, whole sections, read what attracts you, spend time on, in, with a term, even converse with it if you like before moving on. It's a veritable garden of colors and odors from across India with its tremendous diversity. Keywords for India, a conceptual lexicon for the 21st century. The title of the book might, of course, raise a few eyebrows. For India? But this is more than adequately addressed in the introduction. These are a selection of keywords used in India by Indians and even non-Indians and carry within them diverse connotations and associations, social, cultural, political, philosophical, and ideological. These could well be called keywords from India or of India, though I'm not sure the editors would make such an absolutist claim. They are, after all, a selection, subjective as is inevitable, and limited given the humongous task the book sets out to achieve. Keywords, far from being merely descriptive, can be and should be studied as conceptual categories. And what is particularly interesting to note is that commonly used words that exist outside the academic domain are embedded within the contextual conceptual frames that are somewhat different. Indeed, one of the intentions of the book is, quote, discourse mapping and creating a space for a critical self-reflexive engagement with the conceptual terrain of these keywords. The 21st century is in some senses a break with the past. The internet revolution, the accelerated speed of information flow, and the leveling of the hierarchies and distinctions between the academic, scholarly, specialist, highbrow communities and the non-academic, lowbrow, non-specialist ones has led to a democratization of culture. E-interactions through blogs and social media platforms have led have taken debates and discussions outside the privileged space of seminar halls and classrooms into the public marketplace of exchanges that can be extremely vituperative at times, but also calm, reflective, and productive in other moments. It is this space that has thrown up a host of new terms that have gained currency rapidly in the new world, even as older terms have acquired new and innovative meanings. Older certainties and stabilities are dissolving at breathtaking pace, and words are acquiring a life of their own. A key word, as the introduction to the book says, is a quote, cross-cultural viral meme, a transitive moment in which the internet-savvy selfie generation comes face to face with their predecessors stretching back to the 20th century and even beyond, when, quote, prehistory confronts post-truth, unquote. A significant aspect of this book is what the editors have called its hybrid approach, combining two sets of approaches, one of lexicons like Hobson Jobson and Hanklin Janklin, the rumble tumble guides, and two of the sedate erudite tomes like Future of Knowledge and Culture, Dictionary for 21st Century, edited by Vinay Lal and Ashish Nandi, and key concepts for modern Indian studies, edited by Geeta Dharmpal Frick et al. This book includes both quotidian terms as well as abstract philosophical ones. The more than 200 contributors come from diverse professional backgrounds like journalism, medicine, politics, uh, academic sphere, the arts. The little narratives of lived experience jostle for space with the more respectable academic narratives. And both local and cosmopolitan contexts are brought in the short essays that accompany each entry. Through these key terms that represent the vast linguistic, philosophical, cultural, social, and ideological diversity of India, the book challenges the knowledge asymmetries between the North and the South. Privileging a word, elaborating its conceptual foundation, particularly Indian words from the Bhashas, initiates a decentering effect, whereby Eurocentric epistemology can be nudged, if not pushed, from its self-assumed pedestal. Flipping through the book, I was naturally drawn to the entry on Musalman by Taslima Nasreen and Parsi by Keki Daruwala, two rather dissimilar ones as it turned out. My initial expectation was that it would be about Islam. I mean, the entry on Musalman would be about Islam, its cultural and religious dimensions, particularly because it was included in the first section titled Classical Heritages, Databases of Memory. But this expectation was, of course, soon belied by the author, whose piece is all about fundamentalism and the history of conflict between Hindus and Muslims in the Indian subcontinent in the 20th century. Daruwala's piece was more about the history of Parsis in India and their idiosyncrasies. But this is what is unique about the book. Each contributor brings in her own perspective on the term, locates it within her own context, and as the editor says, owns it. Among other keywords I found extremely interesting were UPSC, not just an acronym, but something much more, democracy, as understood by people across the country. This very unique word called adjust, what I mean, it's various ramifications, of course. Jhuggi Jhopdi, a little outdated perhaps, but nevertheless important. Cyber Bhakt, Pravachan, Time Pass, and so on and so forth. One can agree or disagree with the perspectives, but I think the intention here is not to provide the definitive comprehensive guide, though some of the terms actually give that impression, particularly the ones on Atma, Smita, Dharma, caste, etc. But I think the intention is to provide a perspective that can open up a conversation at the very least. Finally, a word about the book's afterlife. Keywords, as Professor Nair writes, will keep changing. New ones will emerge, old ones will be dropped or modified. Hopefully, we will see revisions in this book in the not so distant future. The speed at which things are changing, this may be very, very soon. I also feel that a book like this in Indian languages would be immensely beneficial for non-English language speakers, particularly students and scholars working in other Indian languages. The elaborations of key terms by non-English speaking contributors would also add another dimension that can perhaps be lost in a work in English. So with these few introductory words, I would like to now introduce the very illustrious panel of editors and contributors who have joined us today. Welcome Professor Rukmini Bhaiya Nair, Professor Peter D'Souza, and our colleagues from Ambedkar University, Delhi, Professor Salil Mishra, Dr. Yogesh Dehi, and Dr. Usha Mudiganti. Professor Nair needs no introduction, but I would like to introduce her to this audience. She is Professor of Linguistics and English Emerita at IIT Delhi. After receiving her first PhD degree from the University of Cambridge, she received a second one from the University of Antwerp, a second honorary doctorate for her original contributions to narrative theory. She was the head of Department Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Delhi from 2006 to 2009. She has been Crash Fellow at Cambridge, as well as Senior Professorial Fellow at the National Institute, Nehru Memorial Museum and Library between 2010 and 12, which was followed by a professorial fellowship at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in 2016. In 2018, she was offered the prestigious Tagore Fellowship at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, and in 2019 was Distinguished Visiting Professor at Hunan University, China. She serves on the boards of several international journals such as Language and Dialogue, Literary Semantics, and Text Matters, and also on the consultative as the consultative board of the International Pragmatics Association. As of 2020, she is on the advisory board of the new book series titled Poetry and Philosophy, launched by Bloomsbury. She has, of course, delivered lectures worldwide at several universities and academic institutions across the world. She has also authored 9 books and over 150 papers and articles. Among her academic books, we have Poetry in a Time of Terror, 2009, Narrative Gravity, Conversation, Cognition, Culture, 2003, Lying on the Post-Colonial Couch, 2002, Translation, Text and Theory, The Paradigm of India, 2002, and Technobrat, Culture in a Cybernetic Classroom, 1997. This is actually a very, very short introduction. Her achievements are many more achievements she has to her credit. Welcome, Professor Nair, to SUS and to Ambedkar University. Professor Ronald D'Souza is the D.D. Kosambi Visiting Professor at Goa University. He also holds a visiting professorship at BITS Pilani, Goa campus. He was professor at CSDS till February 2020 and was director of the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, where he served 2 terms from 2007 till 2013. Professor D'Souza works on issues of democratic politics, and in the comparative politics of South Asia. He favors an eclectic approach and searches for the inconvenient fact and recognizes ambivalence that troubles established ways of talking about democracy and politics. He has recently published a book of essays titled In the Hall of Mirrors, Reflections on Indian Democracy, 2018. He has also edited 7 books, the most recent of which are, of course, the current one, which we are going to discuss, Keywords for India, but also Democratic Accommodations, Minorities in Contemporary India in 2019, At Home with Democracy, A Theory of Indian Politics, 2018, Speaking of Gandhi's Death in 2010, Indian Youth in a Transforming World, Attitudes and Perceptions, India's Political Parties, 2006, Contemporary India Transitions, 2000, and of course, apart from this, several new articles in various very prestigious journals, both in India and abroad. So we welcome you, Professor D'Souza, to this event. My 3 colleagues, who are all of them contributors to this volume, hardly need any introduction to the community at AUD. But Professor Salin Mishra is, of course, a historian of modern India, and he has studied at JNU for his master's and doctoral degrees. His publications include a monograph on a narrative of communal politics, Uttar Pradesh, 1937 to 39, and a small booklet in Hindi on Swaraj Party brought out by the National Book Trust. He has published articles on themes related to communal politics, language questions, particularly the question of Hindi and Urdu, and I have had the good fortune of being able to read many of those essays, very, very fascinating essays that he has produced. The Partition of India, Social Science Teaching, and Identity Politics. In 2009, he was a visiting researcher at the Center for History of Emotions, the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, Berlin. Currently, he is, of course, Professor of History at Ambedkar University, Delhi. Dr. Yogesh Snehi teaches history at the School of Liberal Studies. His major teaching and research interests focus on Punjab and debates on popular religion and its practice. He has been a fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla from 2013 to 2015, shortly after Professor D'Souza left. His recently published monograph, Spatializing Popular Sufi Shrines in Punjab, Dreams, Memories, Territoriality, published by Routledge in 2019. It situates saint veneration practices in the partitioned Indian Punjab. Yogesh has also jointly edited a volume, Modernity and Changing Social Fabric of Punjab and Haryana, in 2018. And our last and final panelist for this event, for this session, is Dr. Usha Mudiganti, my colleague from the Faculty of English. She teaches at the School of Letters and at the School of Undergraduate Studies. She is also a Deputy Dean, actually, of the School of Undergraduate Studies, and her research interests are study of childhood in literature, gender studies, and popular culture studies. Her latest publications are Virangana, her entry in this volume that we are going to discuss, the keywords for India, and Et tu Brute, the child soldier and the child victim in Shobha Sakti's Traitor, in an edited volume titled Childhood Traumas, Narrative and Representation. So with these introductions, I'll just sort of set out the way we will proceed. I will invite the two editors first to make brief presentations, beginning with Professor Nair and then Professor Ronald D'Souza. This will be followed by the three contributors and their presentations, either on their own entries or on the general book itself. And then we will invite questions from the audience and have a discussion. So with these words, Professor Nair, may I request you to now make your presentation. Thank you.
So I want to thank you for that extremely comprehensive as well as perceptive summary of our book. That's amazing. And I want to also thank AUD and Usha and other Yogesh, Salil, for giving us this platform to talk about a book about which we're clearly excited. So thank you for that. And I'd like to begin at the end of your talk when you talked about the Afterlife new book. So I want to make 2 points immediately in response to your comment. And the way I see this book is really that it is a pre-COVID document targeting a post-COVID destination. Why do I say this? Because this book came out, so it's in some senses not a new book, because it came out last year in February, towards the end of February, just before we went into lockdown across the world. And not only did we go into lockdown, but the book went into lockdown. And it is only coming out of its kind of Rip Van Winkle slumber now. And so in some ways we have to take into account that this book was written in a pre-COVID world. But now when we read it, given the tremendous disruptions that we face today across the globe and in India with so much economic and political disparity, polarization, and so on, I looked again at this book this morning and thought to myself, well, how would this book address the questions of today? Would it still be relevant because it was written in just a year ago and comprehended, sort of conceptualized long before that. But today, we've had a huge disjunctive um, episode in the life of many, many citizens of countries over the book. So the first thing I would like to address is this question of how relevant is this book today? Now, I was thinking to myself, and as you know, I write poetry among my rather large range of useless activities. And I thought in terms of all the nations of the world, like Humpty Dumpty sitting on a wall. And those Humpty Dumptys were each holding a flag of the nation, maybe Nigeria, maybe Nauru, maybe India, maybe the US. And they were knocked off the wall on which they sat by the gale winds of COVID. So today I view this book as a healing book. I know healing is a pretty anodyne word, but as a book addressed to the task of putting Humpty Dumpty together again across the nations of the world, just as we look for a cure for COVID. So we want to know, how do we put our conceptual maps drawn in a pre-COVID era back into circulation? And I thought that we were actually quite fortunate, Peter and I, because we thought of this book, and in some ways, this book gives us the kind of conceptual mapping that we can return to in terms of what are its potentials for repair, what are its potentials for regeneration. And that's where I think that we have been very fortuitous. Think of America, which is highly polarized. And I was thinking they didn't have this book, and they don't have such a book. And many nations of the world don't. But we were lucky in that we put it together in a pre-COVID age, and it is returning to address the questions of our post-COVID age. So what are these questions? I will begin with the one which you glancingly referred to. So I want to begin with a question, which is a central question, an example as to how it's relevant. And then finally, I want to give a one-page kind of definition of what it is that the book may mean to its authors and to us. And this will be contentious, but let's see. So I want to now talk about a central question. And that central question is from my introduction. It is, how do we use the habitus of the familiar to engage with the unknown in times of unusual social perturbation? How do we use the habitus of the familiar to engage with the unknown in times of social perturbation? Now, we didn't know how dramatic this social perturbation would be, but it was addressed to the task of looking at the world around us, all the invisible elements that we took for granted in terms of verbal encapsulation, and to see whether this mapping, this landscape, this familiar landscape could address the world, this familiar environmental and kind of intimate landscape for us, could address the unfamiliarity of the world we find ourselves in. And this was pre-COVID, but I think it applies to the COVID age. Let me give you an example here. Recently, we have been talking about the farmers' movement. All of India has been talking about the farmers' movement, and not just all of India. Now it turns out across the globe, we've heard of the Toolkit Tamasha and so on. When I looked at this book, I said, oh my God, we have no entry on farmers. And then I looked again a little deeper, and today I saw an entry which really enlightened me, and that was an entry on peasant movements. And what that does is to, let me just see if I can find that entry. What that entry does is to actually, kind of tell us why we have the word farmers movement rather than, let's say, the peasant movement. So why do we have the word farmers movement? And when did we move on from the terminology of, Kisan and Kranti and so on? And he says that we have come to the second category of protests following the Green Revolution. And that is when we started using the word farmers movement. And then he points out that it is from this farmers movement that we have words like Gaavandi, Chakka Jam, Chalo Padyatra. So this Chakka Jam, it's come up in our vocabulary now. But in this book, you have a tracing right from Mughal times of peasant movements, how they've been reinterpreted and interpreted, right down to the Chakka Jam of today. So this tells us, which of course brings in the idea of tractors and so on and so forth. So in some ways, this book, although as I said, it came pre-COVID, addresses the kinds of issues that are that have come to the forefront today. So I would say that you can look at any entry in this book and it anticipates our in Kuwait presence. And one of the things I would say that I was very struck by looking at this book was how much scholarship can go into one brief entry. How much heart, how much dil can go into one brief entry. So this is my example of how the book anticipates the present. And I can give you many more, but that's one. Finally, so I said I would ask the central question, how do we use the habitus of the familiar to reconcile ourselves with the strange? I would give you an example. And now let me talk in terms of a definition. So in my book, and I think you referred to this in passing, in my introduction, I say this book seeks to provide via a constellation of words ranging, and the range is different, from ahimsa to Dalit and demonetization to democracy and dandalati, all the way to the word zero, a discourse mapping of the present. And I think Professor Bodhprakash, you quoted discourse mapping. And these words pertain to India, certainly, but as you pointed out, and as we strongly believe, these words also address a global world where, which is desperately in need of new vocabularies. In fact, if you listen to international radio, English language radio in particular, because not radio, but YouTube, you find how often the words karma and mantra are used on CNN, as if they have to turn to karma. So we have an entry for karma, and it's very interesting, as you said, Professor Bodhprakash, to compare the two, to compare how one approaches the notion of karma from our perspective, where we've grown up with it, and how it's being used in world media today. So that is certainly a project which we have in the future. A more important project is that we have this sort of book in the regional languages in the various states of India, because obviously 259 words and it's already 450, 60 pages, we had to cut down. But I have a list of another 250 words and more. So we don't want to do this just as us. The first round list was certainly drawn up by me, but it's inadequate, as you say, and will always be inadequate. So our aim was not comprehensiveness, which is impossible in a country like India, but comprehension of where we stand. So and this is very much a collective enterprise. It's very hard to speak on behalf of 259, on behalf of 200 contributors and 259 entries. But I think we've made an important start to address this business of discourse mapping, which we need in the world and in India today. So one of the things we've done is, I should point out, is that we have included, I think, for the first time in keywords dictionaries. And I want to refer here to Raymond Williams's sense of dislocation, which started me on thinking about keywords. And Raymond Williams said, you know, he came back from the war in 1945-46, and he found that words like democracy were being used, but they were being used in a completely new way. And that's what gave him the impetus to write the book, that sense of linguistic dislocation, the disappearance of linguistic signposts. So that was Raymond Williams's impetus. Ours was that we had to, as you pointed out, democratize language. So we don't want, so Raymond Williams had 140 words. All of them were high culture words. All of them, you know, so they were, I can give you the range, but they were very, words like democracy or words like violence seen from a very high pedestal. What we wanted to do is to say that Indians inhabit a much more complex cultural space. So we wanted words like of material culture, chula, balti, so on, which are of everyday use, and whichever strata of society you belong to, you will know the word chula, whether you know or do not know a word, the meaning, you know, of Manrega and how to unpack that acronym. So we had acronyms like, as you mentioned, IAS and UPSC and RTI, and we had borrowings from English, which was very interesting. Words like cricket, which we don't even think are borrowings. Words like temple entry. Words like setting, iska setting kar do. So that range was really to us an attempt, or at least to me, at democratization. Finally, let me end with saying that as a linguist, we always look in terms of synchrony and diachrony. So we look at the history of words, and all the essays do that, and a contemporary slice. That contemporary slice is today, the 21st century. And what we're really aiming for with this book is maybe 10, 20, 30 years from now, which of these words will disappear? Which of these words will die? And which of these words will survive? And that's why there is much more stability in words like Atma and Ahimsa, and much less stability with certain kinds of words, like, for example, the concept Harijan contrasted with the word Dalit. Dalit occurs like a refrain throughout our text. Harijan has gone. At one time, that was the word we used when we were in children. That sense of diachrony and synchrony coming together, that's an important arena for our book. There's students out there. So I would say each of these words, 259, are worthy of theses, worthy of unpacking. They are bits of encapsulated memory. They can also be connected with other words. So I think Indians, we live in a world of great mental stress across, and economic stress across the world. I think Indians are very good. Whatever we can or cannot do, we can talk. And we are good at talking. So I think what we have achieved in this book is an exercise to demonstrate to the world verbal stress busting. How do you bust stress? By talk, by conversation, by returning to these notions of how we can fight the constraints which seem to hem us in, how we can augment notions of democratic freedom. These things, I think Indians have something to teach the world, our ability to form not narrow collectivities, but broad interdisciplinary collectives. And I think I must thank our contributors. I know Peter will talk. His view of this book is much more dynamic, it's much more strategic, it's much more focused than mine. But I think he'll talk about the freedoms which this book gestures in the direction of Swaraj and ideas. So this is an adventure in the last resort, an adventure in ideas. And anybody who dips into the book, my word, dips into, will get I do frequently. So I want to say that it is it is a pleasure for me to participate in the discussion today, because I hope to learn and listen. This is also a listening book. So I'll hand over to Peter, without whom this book would not have come into being, and he can talk about Swaraj or whatever else. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Nair, for that very enlightening introduction. Professor D'Souza, welcome, please.
Thank you very much. I'd like to also begin by thanking you, Professor Bodh Prakash and Ambedkar University for organizing this discussion. As you can see, Rukmini and I haven't coordinated our presentations, and in fact, we didn't coordinate the book. It emerged through these multiple conversations that we've had over several years, and both of us remain continuously delighted that every time we pick up the book, we find something that we had not sufficiently appreciated in the course of producing it. It's a book that remains alive, remains active, and remains a gesture towards what is possible in India. If the next edition of this book were to come out, I think Andolan Jivi would be a word that we would bring into it. But having said that, let me just sort of add to what both you and Rukmini have said, which is that the inspiration for this book, in my perspective, is fourfold. One is, of course, Raymond Williams and that whole tradition of producing lexicons and keywords. The second is, and this is what makes the book so exciting, it's a multiple author production. It's not a single author production, or not even just a group of authors of 3 or 4. It's 200 plus contributors, some of whom are here in the discussion. And that, as you rightly said again, meant that we had different ideological frameworks, different disciplinary locations, different sense of what is significant and not significant. It was a huge task getting 200 people to come together and produce this book. I want to say this because we are really grateful that people sort of were cajoled into joining with us in this very exciting project. The third thing I want to say is we recognized at the very start that it could never be a comprehensive exercise. It couldn't even be a representative exercise, because not just because of the diversity of languages in India, there would always be somebody from some corner of the country who would feel keywords from their part are missing in this book, and that's a fact. So at best, this is a first step. This is a kind of opening overture of what is possible, and especially what is now possible with the digital world that is available to us. I agree with you that we struggled a lot on should it be for or of or from India, and that remains an open question. And I think so if at all there is a dynamic, it is keywords for India, from India, of India, all of which in a sense show that there is so much that you can draw from the book. My own engagement in putting it together was political. If Rukmini's was philosophical and linguistic and cultural, mine was much more political. Political not just as a political scientist, but political in terms of a politics of knowledge. So I see the book as, first of all, in a sense, announcing to the West, announcing to the global North, to the epistemic North, that there are a large number of concepts that don't feature in your representation of India, and perhaps your representation of social and reality all across the world. And our book, in a sense, expands the menu of possible representations. So it's a politics of knowledge which does two things. On the one hand, it combats a certain hegemony of the global north over thinking in the global south. Uh, you know, people like Fanon talk in terms of how this epistemology has produced an inferiorization of concepts in the colonized world. And I think that word inferiorization is an important one. It does do that. So our book allows people who don't come from the metropolis of language to participate. So therefore, you'll find a lot of words from the bhasas, which are part of the lexicon. Words which have been invisibilized by the epistemology of the North have now been included. Words that have suffered erasure have now been included. So the epistemology of the North has had a very deleterious effect on our thinking. I mean, there has been a long debate on this, starting with Rabindranath Tagore, K.C. Bhattacharya, and people like that, right up to today. Franz Fanon, Boaventura Santos, Walter Mignolo, Aimé Césaire. So this book is definitely located in the epistemology of the South. Now, how did we do this? We realized that battling the epistemology of the North is a very tough exercise. I mean, it's almost like battling the BJP today. They control every lever of power. They control law, they control technology, they control language, they control university production. So therefore, if we want to participate in these discourses, we have to learn Latin, or we have to use German phrases like Weltanschauung, or we have to draw on French to be able to describe parts of India. So how did we do that? We realized that if we have to sort of drive a wedge into this fairly formidable fortress of knowledge, the way we should do it is through language. And language is the best way to open up the space for concepts and categories that are part of our everyday speech, or part of our everyday representation. So we adopted this is not so conscious. It's not that Rukmini and I sat down and said, okay, what's our strategy to produce this book? I think at one level it was it was coordinated, but fairly minimalist, in the sense that you can't get 200 authors to say, please write according to this manifesto. So it was open. It was free thinking in that sense, but in retrospect, it seems to have done 4 things, and I think that this is what makes it so exciting. So even though the book is organized in terms of 7 rubrics, which both access the high concepts and the everyday words of our everyday lives, in effect, it used four strategies to open up the space for the epistemology of the South. The first is to infiltrate the conceptual space of the North with concepts that have a thick philosophical depth, that have already acquired a certain philosophical depth in India. And so we place them on the table. Karma and Guru and Pandit have already entered, but we've introduced Swaraj and Leela and Rasa and Satyagraha and Izzat and Halal and Haram. So these are concepts that have a thick identity in the philosophical universe outside. Is haram and halal. It's a very rich concept between what is permitted and what is proscribed. Maybe this can become part of a global vocabulary. So the first is to infiltrate the landscape of concepts of global North with concepts that all have already behind them rich philosophical work. The second part of our strategy was to elevate concepts that today are just descriptive words, but which in a sense are used to represent our world, and to elevate them to the level of concepts. So words like time pass, these are fun words. We've had great fun building up a whole strategy of words to include time pass, jhanjat, mela, uh, words which juggi jhopadi, matlabi, such a beautiful word, which is much more exciting than he's cunning or he's devious or he's matlabi, you know. So we've introduced a whole lot of words which people use, including UPSC and LPG and into the landscape of concepts. So first was to infiltrate. The second was to elevate words into concepts. The third is to appropriate, to take English words and to make them Indian words. So VIP, I mean, the Indian definition of a VIP finds, I think, no resonance elsewhere, because not only is a VIP an important person, a VIP in India walks differently, sits differently, dresses differently. And if you're a special category of VIP, then you become a VVIP. And the VVIP is the person who sits in the first row of every function, behind whom sits VIPs. So we've taken VIP, we've taken file, we've taken setting, we've taken love marriage, we've taken vote bank. So these are English words, but they have different meanings in an Indian context. And so infiltrate, elevate, appropriate. Part of our strategy is to populate, because if you introduce many of these words into our social science and humanities vocabulary, I think, in a sense, we will feel much freer to describe our reality. Now, this may sound like old-fashioned nativism or the current version of nationalism. It is not. It is just part of the old unfinished business of anti-colonialism from a cosmopolitan perspective, from a rooted cosmopolitan perspective. So that's why this book is, excites us so much. It was an impossible task. I mean, when we started it, we never thought it would finish, and there were moments of deep despair. It was just Rukmini's optimism and faith which brought it together, and the contributors who stayed with us. Many fell by the side, many joined us. But anyone who sees this book says, how did you do it? It's tough enough to get 12 contributors to contribute to an edited book, as Yogesh will know. But to get 200 plus contributors. We started the book when we got all the contributions in. We had 300,000 words, which no publisher. And they said, sorry, we can't do 300,000 words. Your contract was 200,000 words. And we were faced with a very difficult task of reducing 300 to 200. We settled on 220,000 words. Many contributors were dissatisfied because their long reflections had to be reduced. But I hope they will forgive us. But you now have a book which is a precursor to what I hope will be a continuation. Thank you.
Both you have to unmute yourself, yeah.
So thank you, Professor D'Souza. I was just wondering whether the distinction that you were making between Professor Nair taking care of the cultural part and you taking care of the political part. I actually happen to belong to a sister discipline. I mean, I know Professor Nair is more of a linguist, but I belong to the discipline of English studies. And I was just wondering whether, her contribution was any less political, because even though we work in the broader field of culture, I mean, we do have our ideological, political commitments also. And as she says this very beautifully in the introduction, we fight for things, we may not die for things, I mean, we'll still make our point.
I certainly don't want to say that there was a clear division of labor. I was only wanting to say that whatever was left from after she'd covered the field, I took up. So, mine was a much smaller, distinctly political engagement. Yeah.
Of course, of course. Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So may I now request Salil? Salil, please come in. And I think that Salil, I hope you will talk about not just your entry, but also about your general sort of perspective on the framework of the book itself.
Sure.
That would be very, very useful.
Very useful.
Yeah, thank you both. Yes, I will. I think it's very close to what Peter just said. So what I will do is I will use up my 12 minutes in talking specifically about my entry, but also in what I thought of this exercise of the volume when Peter actually sent me a mail asking me to send an entry. So I thought it was an important exercise, but the way I looked at it was that I thought its importance lay in the fact that it stands somewhere between being a dictionary and actually a repository of social ideas. And I thought it actually combines elements from both. Let me explain. Dictionary actually gives you a meaning of a word, and it makes that word intelligible. But that meaning also acquires a certain fixity and stability. That meaning then does not change with time. It remains the same across generations. And this is how languages are formed, by giving a fixed meaning, which should be resistant to change. It should not change once it's entered a dictionary with a fixed kind of connotation. But the thing about social ideas or about social science concepts are that they must also represent changes across time and space. These social science ideas are like the currency in the exchange of ideas. I mean, social concepts are to social inquiry what currency is to the market. Its value may be fixed, but it shouldn't be very clearly identified. The dollars and the rupees and the pounds. If a monetary currency acquires a fixed value, then it loses out in the market. But if its value is such that it can be fixed by each individual, each interlocutor according to his or her taste and requirement, then again, it loses out. So these are the two pitfalls at the two extremes, also particularly with social ideas and social concepts. Let me call them conceptual determinism at one end and conceptual anarchy at the other end, or conceptual demonetization, if you would like to call that way. Conceptual determinism actually follows the dictionary model, and it imparts one fixed meaning to a term. Terms like secularism, nationalism, socialism, religion, they all acquire one kind of meaning. 19th century Europe was the factory for manufacturing these concepts. And these were manufactured from the raw material or experiences of those societies. But then these ideas and concepts were imported to the entire world, the rest of the world. This was clearly cognitive imperialism, which Peter talked about. Now, this cognitive imperialism actually accompanied economic and political imperialism. And actually it outlasted. Even after the economic and political imperialism was formally over, the cognitive imperialism is still with us. With India, much less, but much more with the rest of the non-European world. So we in India, when we looked at words like secularism, nationalism, socialism, religion, Renaissance, feudalism, and we were perplexed because our concrete experiences, historical experiences, did not always conform to those big concepts. But the superiority of those concepts had already been drilled into us. So what to do? So we raised very unusual kind of questions. Was there feudalism in India? Was there Renaissance in India? These were the kind of questions that we grew up with because we were made to believe that there must have been. If there was not, then there was some problem with us. So people looked around for feudalism and for Renaissance. And the thing about social science inquiry is that if you look for something, you find it. So, or whether it was Indian communism or communism in India. So we said it's Indian communism because it's the Indian variant of communism. This was the power of concepts. The concepts are like blinkers. They exclude possibilities. they kind of strike out certain realities, certain shades of realities in a very a priori kind of manner. You look at what is covered by the blinkers and not what is excluded by the blinkers. You don't look beyond the blinkers. So conceptual determinism is clearly one big pitfall, which is there with us. And I think Peter talked about it. It may work well for a dictionary, but it certainly does not work for a repository of social ideas. Human life is far too volatile, far too dynamic, far too diverse to allow for this dictionary type of approach. But the pitfall at the other end is also very serious, very big, and that is conceptual anarchy. Conceptual anarchy actually can take many forms. One form is, for instance, if nationalism is defined in such a way that it also brings in the opposite meaning, then we have a problem, because there is no exchange can really take place. Then it's your nationalism versus my nationalism. You look at it one way, I look at it the other way. Where is the common ground? Ideas cannot take place, either across cultures or within cultures, across paradigms or within paradigms. Or the other form it can take is that each society or community treats itself as exceptional and believes that it's different, it's exceptional, and therefore either the big concepts do not apply to this society, or they apply in such a way that it does not apply in that manner to anywhere else. So in India, it was fashionable to say that there is one Western secularism and then there is one Indian secularism, and that's all. That covers the entire totality of the world. So a kind of exceptionalism, that problem was there. So for an exercise of this kind, there would be these two kinds of pitfalls. One is that of conceptual determinism, and the other is of conceptual anarchy. And the point is to be able to avoid these two extremes. These kind of things were in my mind when Peter asked me, sent a mail, both Peter and Rukmani, they sent a mail and they asked me to write about 100 words, about 1,000 words on the partition. Now, they said India's partition. I think it was not very clear. I know that they meant India's partition, but they just said partition. Now, I knew when I started writing that India's partition was obviously so significant, so important, so atypical in some ways, that the temptation to practice a kind of Indian exceptionalism was quite great. And I think it would be justified. I still feel that an Indian exceptionalism here would be quite justified. But I also recognized that in the 20th century, partitions are happening all the time. If you look at the history of the 20th century, one thing which is very glaring and very usual is that there are partitions happening all the time. Each incident, every incident, an act of creating a new nation state from old empires, it could in some ways be seen as a kind of a partition. It was a partition from a large territory from the past. So there were large number of partitions. 20th century is actually a century of partitions. So what to do? So I had to keep in mind the Indian specificity, but also while at the same time trying to avoid the temptation of practicing a kind of Indian exceptionalism. So to say, which meant saying that partitions are a part of 20th century history of the world under specific circumstances, collapse of the empire, withdrawal of the colonial states and imperial states, the Second World War, and that produces a climate in which partitions actually become the norm of the 20th century. But having said that, there was something unique, there was something special about India's partition. It wasn't simple, it was not any other partition. So one had to sort of try and do both. And I tried to do it in my entry on the partition. Having done that, having done both, or having attempted to have done both, I also felt that instead of simply describing the partition or providing its meaning, I should also take yet another step, and I should also attempt a kind of an explanation for the partition. So being a student of history where you can get caught in your data, and the idea is to also break out of it and look at it from outside, which in some ways means trying to provide some kind of an explanation, however inadequate or simplistic it might be. So I felt that one paragraph has to be devoted. It's an ambitious task, but there has to be one paragraph which should try and explain the partition of India. So, and I actually did it. I tried to do it. And how I did it is as follows. I said that the partition of India is a product of 3 transformations. I had once read a book on English literature, English language, and they wrote English language is the product of 3 invasion and 1 cultural revolution. And it had such an appeal for me that I also began to look for these 2 or 3. So I said there are 3 transformations. First one is a transformation in India's community profile. A large number of small local syncretic communities. There is a process in which this reality begins to be transformed in such a manner that on the one hand, there is an Pan-Indian community, a national community, but simultaneously you have Pan-Indian religious communities of Hindus and Muslims with a kind of connectivity, with a consciousness and so on. Now, creation of these Pan-Indian communities was virtually a precondition for the partition. So first was a transformation in India's community profile. It took a whole of the 19th century. Then second transformation was an ideological transformation in the 20th century, in the transformation in the politics of communalism, which was making demands, reservation, weightage, safeguards, security, etc. by a minority. But there is a transformation from this kind of a politics into a politics which can also be designated and called an alternative nationalist politics or alternative nationalism or extreme communalism. That happens in 1940 when a demand for Pakistan is made for the first time. So there is an ideological transformation in communalism from a minority politics into an alternative nationalist politics. And third, of course, was a programmatic transformation, program of various organizations, because Movement for Pakistan was led by a political party with its leader, with its program, with its activities. So it was very important, very necessary that the program of the political party must undergo a transformation. So I felt that a combination of these 3 transformation in the community profile, programmatic transformation, and an ideological transformation put together, combined together, will probably give us a clue to the mystery of the partition of India. Well, so this was how I went about my exercise, but on the my particular exercise, but I thought in the book, it is an extremely important exercise, which has to in some ways provide that space, that middle ground, while traversing the middle ground, we find that it may not exist. And then we may have to go to the extremes, but we have to create the middle ground. The middle ground, I hope, has been created, which in some ways moves away from a conceptual determinism, Eurocentrism, European domination, epistemic imperialism, what Peter said, and also a conceptual anarchy in which social science cannot be exercised in a situation of conceptual anarchy. So I hope this volume has been able to straddle, it has been able to actually create that middle ground and traverses it. And if you create the middle ground, then you create it also for others who follow in and use that middle ground. I think I'll stop here. Thank you. Both unmute yourself.
Thank you, Salil. That was very interesting, particularly, the term that you used, conceptual anarchy. I think Professor Nair in an introduction has talked about how these terms have, on the one hand, a certain kind of stability, a certain kind of solidity. And on the other hand, they are being elaborated along different, in different directions. And I think that as long as those elaborations don't become as rigid, as long as there is space for a kind of conversation, as it were, between different conceptions or different conceptual frameworks even, we are fine. I think, and I think that you're right to alert us to the danger of, taking very absolutist positions one way or the other, because that would not naturally lead us very far. I don't know if Professor Nair, you agree with me, but I was just sort of quoting from your introduction, really, what you had said there.
I agree. I have lots more to say, but thank you for pointing it out.
Thank you. May I now invite Yogesh? Yogesh, can you sort of come in now and make your presentation about your entry, which was on the border, or was it border or borders? Border.
Yeah, it is. That's how it is titled. Thank you very much, both. It has been an exciting project, though a very short one, and for someone who has grown up along the border, this also carried certain kind of cultural meaning, because I come from Indo-Pak border. So in a way, this had both kind of that social and the political connect in the era that I was growing up in. I would like to say a few things before I say something about the entry, about the project itself. Actually, I was fortunate to be able to be part of that overlapping phase of Professor Peter's directorship at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, when he was organizing these workshops, conferences around the idea of Swaraj. And I fortunately attended some of those. And I thought that that idea in terms of conception perhaps was gaining ground there, had already led to some very fascinating discussions. I remember attending actually one of those workshops also, wherein this open-endedness of ideas, I thought that part was, that was something that remained with me, open-endedness of the ideas. And also Salil was trying to point out about how concepts, the way at least the theoretical concepts have come to us, have mostly remained concepts of bewilderment, the concepts of problems. But here it was a possibility of thinking of concepts not as problems, but thinking of concepts as solutions, or solution perhaps is not a very great word, but thinking of them as open-ended ideas. So in that sense, I thought that workshop was very fascinating. And as a student of history, how is it that we can think of concepts and conceptions in far more open-ended manner is something that I learned a lot from those set of workshops. So that perhaps would be the foundational moment of me imagining to think about how a very small little entry on the border could have been imagined. Now, interestingly, what had happened that when I received this email from Professor Peter and Professor Rukmini, I just returned from a field immersion trip. Usha was not part of the trip. So that was titled actually Borders and Crossovers. It was interesting that it was overlapping with that trip. I just returned, and I, along this trip with students that I usually take with the course that I teach, we spend around a week in the field thinking and exploring ideas around which that trip has been organized. So this time around, the theme of the trip was borders and crossovers. So in a way, I had something already in the back of my mind around the possibilities of writing an entry like this, thinking about not just the border, but also the possibility of the crossover. So that open-endedness, and I'm just trying to connect with what that workshop on Swaraj of ideas, how a concept can remain open-ended in terms when it is, despite the fact that it is heavily invested, it's not in its flexibility, because border otherwise is a highly inflexible concept. It's a highly inflexible expression, if I put it like that. So therefore thinking of border, but at the same time thinking of ruptures, thinking of not borders, was something I thought that was there in my mind when I was thinking of writing about it. It could have been very easy for me to just think of a narrative of border, but then the possibility of thinking in far more broader sense, not the border sense, but the broader sense, allowed me to think of ruptures also, allowed me to think of not just the fenced border, but also of the porosity of the border. Because when you think of borders as fenced borders, as borders which are fenced along the park or any other border, we are quite rooted onto what you call the physical connects of those borders, the physical boundaries of the border, the territoriality of it. But is it really possible to think of a term like border and to also think of the porosity of the border also? So, and therefore, when I will read towards the end of it, I thought of winds, I thought of birds, I thought of insects. Would they actually recognize borders? So there was a fascinating possibility, therefore, of thinking of the crossover. And that's why I keep coming back on crossover. But obviously, since the word limit was around 1,000 words, actually less than 1,000 words perhaps, I could not explore the possibility of bringing in the dimension of identity. Say, for instance, if I were to write anything on borders, then I would have actually added a dimension of identity into the conception of the border today. But nevertheless, that possibility is still ripe in my imagination. Therefore, when what if I talk about caste as border? Then how would I then think of the porosity of that caste, conception of caste? Could be one way of reimagining the concept, reimagining the entry that I would think of if I were to write it today. But the other thing which actually Professor Rukmini had pointed out very interestingly about pre-corona, post-corona, I think it's a very interesting thing. If I were to write this entry today, post-corona or during corona, how would I imagine writing this particular entry? Is something when borders across the world were closed, the international borders were closed, how would you then imagine the conception of the border? And then at the same time, how actually the borders within India were closed. So we're not talking about national border, we're talking about state borders. In the what Corona induced for something for us which was unimaginable in the pre-corona time, and how actually a pandemic could create a possibility of interstate border which will become non-porous, which is not fence, which will become non-porous. But at the same time, coming back to the conception once again, what both Peter and Professor Rukmini underlined about, what about thinking about borders after farmers' protest or during farmers' protest? How is it that Delhi's borders have changed in that conception? And how that, if I were to write that entry today, keeping farmer movements in mind today, how would I think of Ghazipur? How would I think of Singhu? How would I think of Tikri? And the possibility of the fencing of those borders, but at the same time, how do you situate farmer within the borders? So on the one hand, these farmers, but since I belong to Punjab, I keep emphasizing that point. They come from border. They come from border. It's come from a border state of India. But when they enter into Delhi, they come far from the border. But they at the same time get what you call stuck to the border once again. So borders within the borders, borders within the nation state. I just thought that the possibility of thinking about the same reading today opens up the interesting porosity of the concept, and also the way and possibilities of doing something different in concept. Now, let me just read out the last paragraph of the reading, which I find most fascinating because of the very porosity of the idea of the porosity within the conception of borders. Now, the entry focuses on international borders. Entry focuses on borders which could be riverine borders. Right? It thinks of different kinds of borders. It also thinks about the rituals of borders. Right? We know of sustaining a border. Vaga becomes one of the examples of the rituals of borders. And it seems that many of what we know as religious rituals within rituals of the border actually, it seems like rehearse those very kind of rituals. So I was looking at briefly the similarity between the religious rituals on the one hand and the border rituals on the other, and how they're maintained, how they're rehearsed, how they are ritualized over a period of time. And there were a question of war, there were a question of economy, sustenance, all kinds of these conceptions were there. But towards the end, what I do, I try to think of porosity. And let me just quote. However, it has to be noted that rivers, winds, birds, insects, and music do not recognize borders. So this possibility of porosity, I think was very fascinating. Insects, particularly, and we recently had a huge Tiddidal, once again, just around the corona, the Tiddidal also had come to India, the locust, swarms of locust, which are threatening Haryana. It had actually come close to Delhi also, but they somehow bypassed Delhi. So Tiddidal, say for instance, whose origins are never in India, whose origins are in Pakistan, you see. That devour standing crops have metaphorically remained alive in the historical memory or along the Indo-Pak borders. Don't bother about borders. The Indus Water Treaty between India and Pakistan has tried to resolve distribution of waters. But these very rivers often erode the border fence. And there is a constant complaint along from the BSF on particularly the Ravi border, that Ravi eats away borders, Ravi reorients borders. So the impossibility and the ravageness of the rivers, who doesn't want to recognize borders, do not follow the logic of borders. In recent times, India has blamed pollution coming from Pakistan for smog in North Delhi. So say, for instance, like Delhi keeps constantly saying the problems of smog comes from across Delhi's borders. So Haryana becomes the culprit, Punjab becomes the culprit. On the other hand, if you talk about the larger conception of the Indian nation, they also talk about this coming also from cities like Lahore, cities like bigger cities of Pakistan, smog of north of India. There have also been long tradition of musicians, say for instance, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, whose compositions do not accept the tyranny of the Indo-Pak border. So those porosities actually, and those, I would say in terms of limitations, this entry is limited because it heavily invests on one kind of border, one side of the border. So Punjab becomes quite intrinsic to it. But nevertheless, in terms of porosity, that the possibility that it offers, I thought that was quite fascinatingly possible because I was writing it for Keywords for India. So therefore I stopped. Thank you for this opportunity for writing it once again to both Professor Rukmini and Professor Peter.
Thank you, Yogesh. I suppose borders are one of those things, I mean, there are borders all over. There are borders inside people's minds also. I mean, there are, I mean, border as a metaphor of division, as it were, of partition, exists at several levels. And as you've wonderfully brought this out, the internal and the external borders, which we are constantly trying to protect, but somehow they're always porous. Always porous. Yeah. So thank you. I will now request Usha to make her presentation. Usha, you're there?
Yes. Thank you both, and thank you for this opportunity to make a presentation on a keyword that is close to my heart. It's very close to my heart. And the entire conversation around this keywords for India, I think I had got into the conversation absolutely at the very start of the conversation, if I'm correct about this, because I think Professor Nair was talking about the keywords project in connection with language, emotion, and culture, a project that she was doing in 2010. And that's how this conversation around keywords had begun. And quite a lot of us were enthusiastically supplying keywords to her at the very beginning of the project. And we were having these very enthusiastic discussions with Professor Nair pretty regularly about these keywords. And this keyword was something that she told me about in a conversation about Jhansi Ki Rani, because that word, that phrase Jhansi Ki Rani is very close to my heart. And it was, and not because of any idealization of the Jhansi Ki Rani, but because of the way the phrase is used very frequently. And that is how we were having this discussion, and she said, Virangana. Virangana is a word that occurs frequently across geographies. I mean, across borders, across state borders in the country. So now this is a word that's worthy of exploration. And I quite bravely took on the task of exploring it. And when this book had come out and when this happy discovery was made that there were so many entries from AUD, I obviously immediately read all the entries from AUD. And I started thinking to myself, how do these connect? And I found very strange sorts of connections between partition and border and Virangana. And I'm glad that Yogesh brought in the angle of porosity of borders, because the concept of Virangana to me seemed like a porosity of borders, or at the very least a blurring of borders. Because, I mean, look at this word Virangana. It is talking about embodying a veer, And a Veer is a hero, a masculine hero. And culturally, a Veer is somebody who is a masculine person and is expected to perform masculine activities, or activities that are deemed appropriate for men to perform. Now, when a Veerangana, so it's a portmanteau word of two words, Veer and Ang, right, with a feminine marker. So Veerangana. Yeah, so it's a word that is telling us that here is a woman who is embodying a hero. So a woman is taking on masculine sorts of roles. And she's taking on masculine sorts of roles when it is deemed necessary for her to do so. That concept is in itself extraordinarily interesting, because here we are not talking about women who are choosing a gender fluidity. We are talking about women who are performing a sort of gender fluidity. And that is how the Rani of Jhansi becomes, or Rani of Jhansi becomes an ideal. And therefore she becomes the ideal Virangana. Because here is this person who is taking on the role of a warrior to fight for a right, which is her right. And it is her right to defend her child's claim to the throne. Now, this claim to the throne that the Rani of Jhansi thought that her, and I'm speaking among historians, so I shouldn't elaborate a lot about on it, because I'm sure they would be able to elaborate a lot more on it than I would. But here was a moment in history where a woman was expected to defend a cultural tradition, which was an appropriate Indian cultural tradition of an adopted child being an heir to the property of a family, which is what the royal lineage was about. So, but the British company, which was ruling India, decided that it cannot be done, that the law of inheritance that the British recognized was that of biological inheritance. And therefore, there was a cultural, Professor D'Souza was talking about how the project was a sort of late post-colonial project, or an anti-colonialism project is how he called it, an anti-colonialism project. A late anti-colonialism project was how he called it, and I thought that really made sense for even this entry, which seemed like an entry that was disconnected with various other sorts of directly connected with political identities entries that we have been discussing till now, because here is an entry which is talking about gender. It's not talking about nationalities and nation building and concepts such as the political question of identity. My first thought was that political question of identity does not come into this keyword called Virangana. But I was, upon reflection, I was pleasantly surprised to realize that, in fact, many Viranganas, and not just the Rani of Jhansi, but many other warrior queens are also considered Viranganas, were called Viranganas and celebrated as Viranganas because of their investment in a political identity and their right to a claim, which others were saying they have forgone because of historical circumstances. And these historical circumstances were circumstances that were connected with colonial cross-sectionalities in that period. Now, for instance, when the Rani of Jhansi, it was the doctrine of lapse. But when it came to the Maratha Queen Mother, Rajmata Jijabai, it was not because of any sort of colonial intervention. It was a right which the Rajmata thought was her son's right as an able and efficient person to become the king. And there was a consolidation of power that happened, which she encouraged. And she encouraged it through various means that were by doing duties that, or by standing in the place of an absentee father figure. Because Shahaji Raja was busy working for the Sultan, and Shivaji was therefore brought up almost single-handedly by the mother. So quite often, when we see these Viranganas in Indian history, we realize that they are taking on a lot of roles that men are expected to perform, but they are performing it. It's women who are performing it, and they're performing it while they are presenting themselves in a feminine garb and in feminine clothing and through feminine gestures. So it's a sort of blurring of boundaries that is happening. A blurring of boundaries where there is a sort of fluidity that is possible in moving across very clear-cut gender performative aspects. So, which I thought was quite unique and quite unlike the very rigid and straight-jacketed sort of ideas of gender roles and gender performance. So, which is why this concept seemed very fascinating to me, and that's how I felt that it somehow connected with this porosity of borders that Yogesh was talking about, and that is where I think I will stop, and I'll hand it back to both for both to take this forward.
Yeah, thank you, Usha. I think that all the three contributors, I mean, there is one unifying thread, you know, whether it is Salil or Yogesh and Usha, they're all talking about the key terms that they contributed to in terms of a certain conceptual space, which is not sort of, you know, it's kind of fluid. It's a fluid conceptual space at that level. So, and I think that actually connects very well with the overall conception of the book itself, which is basically to look at how contexts and associations are elaborated through different kinds of are elaborated in different kinds of conceptual frameworks in these key terms. So I think that is one of the interesting features that has emerged, and I'm sure many more of the terms that have been discussed here. I tried reading. When I said I tried reading, I'm only sort of expressing my own limitations. But I began with the first two entries, you know, which are basically to do with philosophical key terms like Atma and such like, and they seem to me to be quite authoritative entries, you know, in the sense that they were, but as I said, this is a matter of perspective. But certainly the three contributors from AUD have presented a very, very different kind of picture, which is more in keeping with our own conception of what the intention of the book was. So, so thank you all for your presentations. Now, Professor Nair, there was, if I remember correctly, you had sort of, we have amongst the audience another contributor from this volume. I'm afraid I don't know. I don't know this gentleman, but perhaps you could introduce him, and if you would like to make a brief presentation himself about this book and about his entry, it would be wonderful. Can you please introduce him?
I don't know him personally, but he came through as a common friend, and when his name came on the screen, I recognized it. However, I do want to introduce him, and I do want to invite him to talk. And if there are any questions in the chat box, maybe we could address those as well. The way I want to introduce Manu Chakravarti, whom I have never met face-to-face or even online, is I just saw a review which is in Outlook. And I think it says words for now and later. And the reason I'm mentioning this review is that it specially mentions Yogesh Snehi as well as Manu Chakravarti. So I thought that maybe I could read that one paragraph from this review, which is an excellent review as well, for example, in Hyderabad, from a professor in Hyderabad. And this is an Outlook. And he says, the terms in the book have been carefully chosen, balancing vocabularies of the more formal academic discourse and the popular. The writers, who range from academics to activists, bureaucrats to artists, have tried to offer what can only be thought of as a multiply inflected meaning. Now, this idea of inflection of meaning, I think it fits in with the idea of porousness. Like Yogesh, I study, or at least not like Yogesh, I don't know whether Yogesh does, but as a cognitive linguist and also as somebody interested in cultural theory and who writes about it, one of the things we do is to look at the distinction between animals and humans and what makes us human. And one of the things that we notice about the human body is that it has lost almost all its hair and the skin has become extremely porous. So although the skin seems as if it is firm and holding the whole body in place, it is in fact human beings are porous both in embodied form and in their mental apparatus because of the flexibility of the brain. So what we are attempting in this book, when we talk about these two poles of cognitive anarchy and cognitive determinism, I have tried to discuss, I don't know whether you've seen the book, but I have tried to discuss this notion that the porosity is a concept which runs across the entire text. And what this reviewer says is that he says that this volume they capture the historical origins and dimensions of the term, for example, jatra or sati, jauhar or border, even as they allow us to see the possibilities for reconfiguring, which I would call porosity. Depending on our needs, the scope of a word will past. Now we come to Yogesh. If, for example, border has a specific geopolitical meaning, Yogesh Snehi's entry concludes with a paragraph seamlessly sliding into a larger argument about the environment. That's when you talked about insects and so on. And we asked this question, how similar are we to insects or animals? So, and he says, so Yogesh, he says, seamlessly, Yogesh Snehi's entry concludes with a paragraph seamlessly sliding into a larger argument about the environment on the irrelevance of the word for, of this word for water and air, and he doesn't mention animals. Similarly, the entries by, he mentions Imtiaz Hasnain and so on. And then he talks about, Manu Chakravarti argues, talks about heterogeneity in the word sogadu, from which moves from an agricultural origin to describe heterogeneity and resistance to classifications. not amounting, I guess, to anarchy, because we've structured the volume in such a way that that determinism doesn't stop you from crossing the borders between the 7 categories that we've set up. Anyway, about Manu Chakravarti, he says, Manu Chakravarti, this resistance to classifications, Manu Chakravarti argues, is used to open up questions that resist notions of purity, of caste, religion, linguistic expressions, food habits, music, dance, and other artistic expressions. So this reviewer says that this is a book whose idea has come, and he specifically mentions the entries by Yogesh Snehi and Manu Chakravarti as, in my understanding, actually animated by the notion of porousness, which is both a cognitive notion as well as a political notion. As an embodied notion, it's political and it's cultural. So I think that what we've done in this discussion is to put out this variety of voices, and not one entry in this book is not somebody I would not trust with all my heart because of their commitment to the idea of debate and their scholarship. So I think that Manu Chakravarti and Yogesh Snehi, even though we didn't expect him to be here, talk across a border, across a virtual border. We shake hands, but also across a cognitive and mental border. And this is precisely what I think the book is doing. And it's good that not only in our discussion, which has been fascinating, but also in reviews, one after another, this idea of how we can have an entanglement of concepts, which is not complete anarchy or floppiness, which is in fact connecting to important issues like caste and gender, which Usha talked about so movingly. So I think, Manu, if you would respond to this idea that, you entered this project independently from the people at AUD, but you too responded to this idea that although you were looking at the Kannada word Sogadu, you were connecting it with larger ideas of caste and so on, which somehow bind our very plural polity together. Manu, will you speak if you want to?
Yes. Actually, I'm not prepared at all. It's by chance that I'm here. My friend Chandan Gowda sent me the link. And this is also a personal request. May I have some access to the book, a link to the book, because I've had no information after making my contributions. So it's also a personal request to send me a link so I can have some digital access to the book. But I will try to make some sense of what I try to do. I chose another word called kayaka, labor. Of English literature, of cultural theory, I was sick and tired of all these Foucauldian paradigms, Derrida. And so decolonization also means borrowing from those colonial masters or those anti-colonial masters. So I paid some attention to the Kannada intellectual tradition, trying to see if we could contest these very dominating paradigms, categories. And as my very dear friend D.R. Nagaraj used to say, we should not use categories borrowing from whom we are fighting. So you see, the word kayaka, I will come to Sogadu in a minute. The word kayaka, labor. In fact, I wanted to show that this had something to do with a sense of a free community and which originated in the 11th century. Which was misrepresented even by somebody like A.K. Ramanujan in his introduction to Speaking of Shiva, the Vachanas, saying that this was something like the Protestant movement, the Protestant work ethic. In fact, it's very clear that Kannada scholars have argued that this had nothing to do with the Protestant work ethic, because it also united people from different professions, different caste groups, communities, and also anti-state. In fact, it was destabilizing. So I was also interested in looking at what Weber had to say about Protestant work ethic, what R.H. Tawney had to say about religion and the rise of capitalism. But here was Basavanna, 11th century, and the Vachana movement was a very divergent movement, heterogeneous movement. So for me, there were origins of an anti-colonial discourse, so to say, from the 11th century, and I didn't have to resort to any word from the Western intellectual tradition. I'm not a simplistic anti-Western fellow. I'm not a nativist in that sense. So there were scholars like Shamba Joshi, one of the most magnificent scholars, who were digging into the past without being nativist, without being indigenous, or without being Occidentalist, so to say. Sogadu figured because it meant flavor of the land, flavor of food, flavor of dance, flavor of music, and you could use it with reference to traditional Indian music, classical music, and talk of the Sogadu of Western classical music. So here was a word which was constantly expanding itself, moving out of boundaries, territories. And therefore, for me, these two words both resonate the nuances of a language, of a thought, of a center of consciousness, which resist very strict definitions. So these are words that are not definite at all. In that sense, I saw the possibilities of a very well-guided intellectual anarchic position in these. So my interest was in the anarchic nature of the Kannada intellectual tradition. So I chose these words, kayaka, labor, which literally means labor, work, but which defies all categories of explanation of labor, including the Marxist definition of labor, and was rooted in our own cultural traditions. So the politics of the word is also rooted in cultural traditions. This was interesting for me when I was interested in the cultural politics of the Kannada intellectual tradition. I'll be brief and I'll stop here for the moment.
Yes, thank you so much. I will answer your question about the availability of the book, which has caused Peter and me enormous anxiety and pain, because we have not been able to get, in fact, all the books that I have, I buy myself from the internet, because we don't have an e-copy. The last thing I have is uncorrected proofs. But this is a technical discussion. Let's have it later. I'm glad that...
let me make it clear, I was not blaming anybody. Just
okay, I understand that.
No blame game here.
No,
I'm sorry,
I understand.
I've given that impression. No.
Yes, no. So, and I want to thank you for coming on and talking about the significance of these words, because they are in line with what we've been discussing. And one question which the chair raised right at the beginning, Professor Bodh Prakash, he said, you know, why all the contributors are Indian, and why don't you have people from elsewhere? And this is important. We don't want to leave people out. So it's not an exclusive project, but somehow we have not been able to hear voices like a Manu Chakravarti or a Salil, or all of us speaking together in a cultural space in the same confident manner that we should be doing. Whether we are talking about Basavanna, whether we are talking about the Bhakti poets, and whether we are taking on Ramanujan's views or not, there is a lot of area for dissension, for debate, and so on. So I think that in some ways we have, as Peter said, opened up a space. And I hope what I found from all our contributors, without exception, is that they are prepared to debate and cross over to the other side to discuss things that they are as aware of Marx and R.H. Tawney as they are aware of their own cultural traditions. This is rare. And so far, all this has been invisibilized, and we don't want a sort of uncritical nativism. So what we do want is this knowledge of cultural interaction both within India and globally. And this is why we said they're keywords for India, for ourselves to learn, and also from India, because all these keywords can benefit what Peter was calling these imperial traditions, colonial traditions of mind capture. So I think that, thank you very much.
If I might get just one sentence across.
Yeah, sure.
You know, this,
I'm not the chair, but go ahead.
Yes, this was also my opportunity to fight these right-wing fascists. In fact, this whole paper captured the imagination of those people who didn't know, who were struggling for an idiom, a cultural idiom to fight the right-wing fascists. So when I dig into this, I'm not so much anti-West as I'm anti-right-wing Indian nationalism fascism. And this also comes from the tradition of Gandhi and Tagore. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, and that's right. And you can see that in this review, of the many names in the book, you have been picked up because that has been recognized as a voice for emancipation, if not freedom. So that said, I would like to hand back to Professor Bodh Prakash, who is the chair, and maybe he would like to, I don't know whether the audience has questions, but somebody can answer.
Thank you very much. I think Mr. Chakravarti has brought in a very refreshingly new dimension, particularly related to Kannada intellectual traditions. And I think that is very much a part of this ongoing debate that we've been having. Thank you all for these wonderful presentations. And I think that we've all benefited tremendously from these. But I would now, we have very little time left, but I would certainly like to invite a few questions from the audience. If anybody would like to ask a question, make a comment, agree, disagree, please just raise your hand or just begin speaking. The panelists are all here. They're waiting to address your queries.
Vishika has raised her hand.
Yes, Mishika.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking aloud. There was this talk about, having some middle ground, where you can at least sort of agree on some things, some fundamentals that can allow you to allow different definitions of a term to be in conversation, and for some kind of a growth of the concept and some kind of a stability to the concept. So I just want to just randomly ask, for instance, somebody took the example of nationalism, and if two people say that it's all very relative and your definition of nationalism has nothing in common with my definition of nationalism, then there is complete conceptual anarchy. But I just, out of curiosity, would want to say that is that in fact, to some extent, what we're seeing, that, somebody's definition of nationalism is completely, at least in the way it kind of, finds expression in what they say and do, seems to be completely in conflict with somebody else's definition of nationalism, to the extent that that person is the antithesis of what a nationalist is to that nationalist person, which is an anti-national. So just a random reflection around concepts and how we understand them, connecting it to the contemporary scenario.
Excellent intervention, Viksha. Salil, would you like to say something about that? Because I think the what is not nationalism, sometimes we don't, people choose to call it nationalism. Some of us may not even call it nationalism. But Salil, would you like to come in on that?
Can I, before Salil comes in, I just want to say that the Fontana Dictionary of Modern Thought, because we discussed this in our courses, defines nationalism as the most powerful force in modern history. And when you have such a powerful force, I mean, we don't have to accept the Fontana Dictionary, but say for a moment we do, the power of this idea has swept, it's a meme. It has swept across boundaries, especially in the 19th and 20th century, and it has been used to support both colonial ideas and non-colonial ideas of nativism. So I don't think that when you have a broad concept like nationalism, what you can do is what you have to do is to cleave unto a position. There is still the space for dialogue that we are creating inside this book, because this is one of the most powerful emotive forces in modernity. This word is known by everybody across the globe. So when Yogesh is commenting, I would really, did you ask Salil or Yogesh to comment? Sorry, can't hear you. You're muted.
I said I was asking Salil, I'd be happy if Yogesh responded to this too.
Yes, Salil, please, when you respond, just tell us something about whether you think a force like nationalism is a modern invention or whether it goes back to something like nasi, which means to be born in a place. And so it relates to Mera Gaon, Mera Desh. You know, it's a very, very basic concept for anybody to form an environment. So is it a modern concept is what one of the things I wish to know, as the Fontana Dictionary says. In addition to Victor's excellent observation.
Yeah, well, the picture in my mind is basically this, that social science is not completely consensual. It cannot obviously be in a manner in which life sciences are. Yet social science is not entirely non-consensual either. Therefore, and there are ways, sometimes messy ways, sometimes not very clear ways, but there are messy ways through which this consensus, a baseline consensus, is acquired in social science inquiry. So there is therefore a consensus in social inquiry on what constitutes the essence of nationalism. But no inquiry can really set its outer boundaries in such a manner, in a very non-porous manner. And yet you have to have conceptual boundaries. So nationalism, if it's explained in a manner in which it also brings in the opposite meaning, then we have a problem. So the picture in my mind is that there is a kind of a baseline consensus, should be, on what constitutes the boundaries, the essence, the internal content, the flexibility of nationalism. But yet there is something called nationalism, which means that each concept must have a boundary, no matter how porous. So there is something which is not nationalism. So not every identity politics is an example of nationalism, though nationalism emanates out of identity politics. So nationalism must of necessity be a form of identity politics, but that does not make every identity politics an expression of nationalism. What distinguishes one from the other? There are fairly well laid down ideas. These ideas get discussed. These ideas get debated about. But on the whole, this is how social science inquiry proceeds. Also on the modernity, the antiquity, is it primordial, evolutionist, modernist? On that, I think the debate has very substantially tilted in favor of modernity. That it uses traditional terminology, nation, desh, country, all of them become words for nation, but that's because nationalism appropriates multiple words and uses them for itself. But on the whole, there is a consensus towards modernity. Thank you.
Thank you, Salil. Yogesh, you want to come in?
No, I think Salil is an authority on nationalism, so I think point is clear enough.
Can I make a small intervention? Before we close this, let me first respond to the question. I think when we set about, compiling our list of entries and building up a directory of scholars and possible contributors, we kept it very open. So you will actually find a fairly large diversity of ideological positions in the collection. Which is not to say that it was completely open, because obviously the people who we thought were good and capable and interesting, in a sense, belong to our sense of the political. So you will find very few entries from people across the aisle, as they say, across the political aisle. That's first. So the manuscript was not, we didn't deliberately set out to find a middle path. We kept it open. There is a diversity of positions, but those diversity of positions, in a sense, belong to, a subset of an open universe that was ideologically friendly with us. Secondly, I think we began with an assumption that many concepts are contestable. So even though we steer from these two ends that Salil so clearly and eloquently put, between the determinist and the anarchic, we recognize that concepts are contestable. Some are more contestable, some are essentially contestable, some are contestable because they haven't been adequately inhabited. And when you inhabit them with detail, historical, sociological, etc., they remain contestable at the borders, but by and large, an overlapping consensus emerges. Now, so that's the second point. That we've tried to bring in concepts that speak to other concepts, that through that conversation get inhabited and therefore get enriched. So a word like baat-cheet, now for example, you would not find that in any respectable lexicon anywhere in the world. And yet for us, it's a substitute for dialogue, for conversation, for negotiation, for interstate communication. It's a word that is used to reflect on many things, from arranging a marriage to sorting out the Indus water treaty. आपने बातचीत किया. So we are trying to we've also tried to do that. And finally, I want to thank Ms. Manu Chakravarti for actually, in a sense, affirming our intuition. As Rukmini said, we'd never met Manu. I mean, I knew Salil, I knew Yogesh. So when we set about preparing our list of possible invitees, many of them we knew, and some we did not know. And yet, when Manu speaks, he opens a whole world of intellectual vibrancy that we believe is out there, and that doesn't enter the seminar hall of the English-speaking world. I mean, when he said he was fed up of borrowing terms from the continental debates, I shared that feeling, and so when I said this is a continuing post-colonial exercise, that's exactly what we were referring to. In fact, the tragedy of the book is that there are so few words from these multiple worlds that Tamil, Telugu, Konkani. I mean, I used a bit of nepotism and twisted Rukmini's hand and got her to say Dev Barekoru rather than thank you at the introduction. A word from Konkani. What a beautiful word. So yes, this has to be seen only as the first step of opening the space, because what we're going to discover is a world rich in metaphor, rich in conceptual depth. I mean, I myself have just started reading translations of literary works in Kannada and Tamil and Marathi. And I'm just fascinated by what you can say in these languages which you cannot say in English. Not just because the words allow it, but also because in English they sound offensive. In English they're proscribed. So if you read Shivaji Savant's, for example, Mrityunjay, or you read even Bhairapa's Parva, I mean, there's a whole new universe which is delightful. So can we bring those universes into the seminar room dominated by the metropolis? Our first book is an attempt to say, yes, you can. We've given you a list. It is not comprehensive. It is not representative. There are many things left out. A little nepotism helps. But yeah, this is the beginning of and I mean, I'm so thankful to AUD for affirming an intuition, because when Rukmini and I sat down over several years, multiple meetings, we were just going with lists of words, lists of names, lists of words. So, you know, it was impossible to find, say, a scholar in Manipuri who would be willing and then give us a word. And yet we know, you know, that needs to be explored. Thank you.
Thank you. We've run out of time now, I'm afraid. And I will, unless anybody has any more questions, I will now request Usha to give the concluding remarks. Usha?
So, Muskan, you wanted to say something?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Good evening, sir. Good evening, ma'am. Good evening, everybody here. I wanted to make an observation, number one, which is that I remember going on an educational trip with Professor Bodh, and we were on a trip to Amritsar. And there we were at the border, and how, we were making an analysis of what was happening at the parade there, and being there at the Wagah border where we were watching that beating retreat ceremony, and we understood how people from both the ends, on the Indian side and on the Pakistan side, were behaving in the same way. So probably the slogans that they were raising, or the songs at which they were dancing. So, the observation that Professor Yogesh was making, I think it, because the fact that being at the border seemed porous, because people from both the ends, they seemed to be the same. They were behaving in the same way. They were speaking in the same lingo and shouting slogans in the same lingo. So that is one observation that I wanted to make. And apart from that, if we could just maybe talk about for a minute about how the word social distancing has been used in India. I mean, the way we've used the term social distancing, being literature students for years altogether, and then how the word was used in this 1 year, where we were actually talking about physically distancing from the other person, but it turned out to be social distancing. I mean, something that is intrinsically, when somebody views it from the perspective of an ideology, how do we view social distancing, and how it was confused, how physical distancing was confused with social distancing. So if we could talk about that a bit.
Yeah. Thank you, Muskan. And Yogesh has actually referred to the Wagah ceremony in his entry on borders. Thank you for that observation. Yeah, Usha.
So I don't know what we can say about social distancing, Muskan, in the next 1 minute or so. But if Professor Nair wants to say something.
Yeah, I do want to say one thing, which is that, I recently wrote an article for the Handbook of Pragmatics on caste, the language of caste. And what I showed by quotes from Nair texts and so on, is that social distancing, so many paces should be the difference between an Irava and a Nair, and so many, this should be the distance between a Nambudri and a Nair. So I'm sorry about this. This was inbuilt, and so for us, we understood social distancing cognitively, and this is what I meant initially when I talked about how we may be in a post-COVID universe. So there will be words like social distancing which come up, but we have a history and a structure, sort of social structure, which shows how social distancing was practiced across in our country, and how it can also be linked to the language of global post-COVID, analyses. So I want to say to you that this is something that is an ongoing task. You're a student, you will have to contribute to these debates, these, kind of hypotheses that we have about how in India social distancing was already normative in terms of caste and economic distance. And so that's what I want to say, is that we are thinking about these problems, but we need your help. Okay, that's all.
So thank you very much. Thank you, ma'am. And thank you to everybody who was present here. I said thank you, ma'am, first because of what she told our student Muskan, that you should also join in now to expand this conceptual lexicon. And with that, I'll also thank Professor Peter D'Souza, who said our first book in his closing remarks about this project. So I'm guessing that there is a second book, and I'm looking forward to it. So thank you for giving us that optimistic note about a second book, in which probably many more of our students, including Muskan and Viksha, would want to come in and talk about these new words that have come in: lockdown, social distancing, mask, vaccine. Everybody's talking about vaccines. Nursery
We already
children.
have terms for a new book now.
So there are many new books, and therefore probably many more such panel discussions. And with that, I'd also like to thank the people who helped us in organizing this panel discussion. The people at IT Services in AUD, the Director of IT, and Mr. Mukesh, and Mr. Ramiz, and Mr. Ashutosh, and the staff at SUS, School of Undergraduate Studies, who helped with the logistics. And of course, I would like to thank the panelists, because, where would the panel be without the panelists? But more importantly, where would the panel be without the audience? So thank you very much, audience, for hearing us out and for intervening. And my special thanks to Dr. Manu Chakravarti for joining in and talking about his work and enriching this discussion. So, and thank you, Professor Prakash, for sharing.
Thank you all. Thank you, Usha. Thank you, everybody. And I hope we can continue this dialogue and this debate and this conversation in the near future. And thank you.